In October and November 2020, a series of online talks on Christianity were run by Genexis, a Christian group that seeks to ask challenging questions about life and faith. I attended these sessions along with many other atheists, including Darren, who listeners will know from our Alpha series of reviews. This episode is part 1 of our review of the Genexis series, which covers the first 4 sessions.
First off, I think you should get him onto your podcast at some point.
I will. Paul Downs, QC. He says he loves this kind of thing, so yes. So just to put a little pin in the beginning of this. So we've just come off from our last hour and a bit of call with the first Genexis study group time talk. So we had most of it was a talk by a chap called Paul Downs, QC, and he did a general presentation, touched on evidence, touched a bit on cosmology, touched a bit on some of his reasons for thinking there to be a creator. And Darren, you were on that as well. Tony was also on that in the background. And so we're just doing a very quick, however long it takes, discussion on what we've just had. So I've just said to Darren that there was nothing new in that. And Darren says he actually thinks there was. So what was new in that, Darren?
Paul is the very first apologist who actually understands what evidence is. He defined evidence as one or more reasons to believe something is true, facts and inferences from facts that must be reliable and must be actual facts. I have never, ever, ever come across an apologist that's ever defined evidence like that, because they all seem to want to be able to make things up and call it evidence.
Yes, and that's a good thing. And quite often a philosophical argument, especially if it's in a well-formed syllogism, is rolled out as though it's evidence or even a proof.
Yeah, so that instantly made me like Paul. I mean, I may disagree with everything else that he says, but I actually like him for that reason. And he seems like a nice guy.
Yes, me too. And I did bring up, when in the brief group time that we had, I did bring up the things that he said about evidence and listing it out and those steps as being the highlight for me of what he said. So I will contact Paul, and because he did say in the group time that he'd love to have some of these longer conversations. He loves to have a debate for a couple of hours. So clearly that's his QC training. So yes, I will contact him and I'll see what I'll be able to get from that, because he did say that he's the founder of Genexis. So this is clearly the sort of thing that gets his juices flowing. I'm assuming it's his QC brain as well. He loves having these kinds of conversations because he does it professionally. So let's see what we can do to get him on. Okay.
I'd love to be a part of that.
Okay, we will do that. Let's do that. I'll fire off an email to him this week and we'll try to arrange that. Anything else from the presentation? Because most of what we've had was a presentation. Actually, before we do that, how was your group time? How did you get on with that? Because the group time was quite short, so let's cover that quickly.
They had some specific questions that they were asking just to get people running, and I think they knew they didn't have a lot of time. But the questions didn't seem very well considered. Like the first one was, have you ever, in a law or science context, dealt with evidence? And I thought that was kind of weird because most people are neither scientists nor lawyers, so that seems like it would be a weird first question to have. But
it's probably a good thing to get people thinking, I guess. And what was the demographic of your group?
Mostly it was all UK except for me. There were, I want to say, 6 or 7 people, all male except for one, but they all were older. And I know at least 3 of them were Christian. I don't know about the other 2, but I'm guessing they were probably all Christian if they were in this.
Mine was a bit more mixed up than that. I think we were all UK based. It was there was 7 of us, including 1 leader, 3 ladies, the rest were men, 3 atheists, so almost 50% atheists, 2 of whom were former Christians. So that surprised me, and that was different from my experience on Alpha. And so we didn't touch any of the questions. The group leader, who is a minister of the church, he said he didn't feel that there was time to really do justice to the questions, so encouraged us to chat about what we found interesting in the talk. And we pretty much went to the evidence discussion, and then there were a few other talks around that. But the other 2 atheists, well, one of the other atheists was certainly very chatty. So I think we're going to get some good discussions over the next few weeks.
Yeah, there definitely wasn't enough time there. I was about to respond to what one of the other people were saying about miracles not being testable, and but then the little pop-up thing saying, you only have 10 seconds left. I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to get into that because it would have been a really juicy conversation
absolutely.
to have.
I'm sure you'll get a chance for that. The minister picked up, and I think I'm going to get on well with the minister who's leading my group, because in the dying minutes he said, so you guys who identify as atheists, can you explain what it is that you mean by atheist so that I don't jump to the wrong conclusion on that, because people tend to read different things into what atheist means. So the first one came out and said, I am absolutely hard atheist, there is absolutely no other being, and that is my position. And then I started to go, and I had my whole thing about why I'm agnostic atheist and all that. And then my pop-up came up and it said, you got 10 seconds left. So I just said, I'm 6.9 on the Dawkins scale. See you later.
Yeah, that's good, because most people don't realize that just because you're an atheist doesn't mean that you're claiming there is no God. So that was cool that he asked that.
Yes, it immediately endeared me to him that he asked that. So let's see how we go along. With that bit out the way, I've got some notes that I took during the presentation. Is there anything that jumped out to you from the presentation that you want to discuss?
Most of it was evidence, what he considered evidence, the structure of the evidence, the subject matters that he went over, of why he thinks there's a God, are sort of interesting. And I'm guessing that even though he's stressed evidence here, he's probably not going to be using the term evidence very consistently. If, for example, one of the things that he says is evidence for a God is that he wouldn't want to live in a universe with no purpose.
Yeah.
And so I'm guessing that he's going to be a little inconsistent with how he uses evidence. So,
yes, I thought so. I thought that too. What he did was, right at the beginning of his talk, I wrote them down, so I'm going to read them out quickly for listeners. He said that he's got 6 reasons why he thinks that there being a God is more likely. So they are, very briefly: without a creator God, the universe has no meaning or purpose, and therefore we, as people, have no meaning or purpose. And he didn't like that idea. Right. The second one was, there must be a moral dimension to reality. Human rights is a real concept.
Yeah,
Number 3,
he called them non-material laws.
I know,
which I'm not entirely sure what that's supposed to be. But
no, I really want to pick that one apart, so we'll have to make sure we get him on. His number 3 was the Big Bang. The Big Bang has creation event written all over it, which, again, for people who listen to my podcast, hop over to the Proscenium feed, where we had a wonderful chat with Skydive Phil, where we had tackled this very specific subject.
Another place to find real good information about that is on YouTube, and it's the PBS Space Time YouTube channel. And they do an excellent job of going over what the science actually is on that.
Yeah. Number 4 was fine-tuning evidence that the universe is fine-tuned for life, and that got picked apart a little bit in the post-dialogue on that. And then we've got his 5th one was DNA molecule looks too elegant to be the result of a fluke accident. Well, then we've got argument from incredulity. And we've been praising this guy as being a QC and of having a really good layout of what evidence means. And then he goes and makes a statement like this.
I know, right?
And then his 6th and last one was free will. So typical theist.
Right.
So those were his reasons. I don't find any of those under any criteria being, I was going to say more than 50%, but I don't want to fall down that sinkhole. None of those are convincing for me in any way whatsoever, and I think all of those can be adequately dismissed.
Yeah, the problem is that if the Big Bang and the fine-tuning actually was what the Christian was saying it was, rather than something else, which it is actually something else, not what they're saying it is, that actually would be fairly good evidence for something going on. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily point to a God. It could be to a specific law that, universe creating law of some sort, physical law. But it would actually be fairly compelling for something happening. The problem is that they never get the science right. They never get what's actually being said or what we've been finding to be true right. So it's real hard to take that kind of thing seriously when they can't even get what they think is supporting their argument correct.
Yes, that's right. And his reasons are all very okay, they do point to science, but he didn't really list or reference anything that we would recognize as evidential science in his 6 reasons. They all fell onto the standard philosophical arguments that we see coming out of Christians.
Yeah, well, to be fair, I think that was just an overview of what we're going to be seeing over the next few weeks. I think this week was specifically what he considers to be evidence and burden of proof. So
that's right. And he did talk about, so moving on a bit, he did talk specifically about things and examples of things that are evidence in the bit of his thing. But he did the standard thing that bugs me when we have conversations with theists where they try to say there is evidence for a God and there's evidence for a creator, and we say, okay, well, how do you gather that evidence? And then they go to a physical example that we know in our world, which something that we both recognize as being an evidential gathering process and what goes on. And in this case, it was a car that gets a dent in it in a car park and the steps you go to. And I don't think either you or I had any issues with that example over the car and what went on and the conclusions that came from. But what he didn't do was he didn't apply any of that template to the God. And I've tried to have this conversation with Christians before. It's like, okay, you've given a good example. We both agree with that. Now let's move that template to the God. How do we do it? How do we do this kind of test for your assertion that there's a God? And the answer immediately comes back, oh, no, but God doesn't work with science. Science can't, by default, measure God. So, okay, so you're disqualifying what you've just laid out as a good evidential process to apply to your God. But that is what you gave me when I asked you the question of how do we measure evidence for God? So which one is it? Does it work or doesn't it work?
Yeah. It basically comes down to how do we figure out if a God can get a dent? It's, because we know the car works because we know what cars are. We know what the materials they're made out of are. We know that if you apply enough force, it's going to deform the material. And we know what kind of things are in a parking lot that can happen. We had someone that actually saw the car before and after. Okay, so what material is God made out of? What effects can it have? What affects it? Did anyone see the God beforehand and then after to see if it got dented? I mean,
can you catch the God on CCTV?
Right. It's one of those things that if we had as much evidence for a God as we did for that car, this would be an entirely different conversation.
Absolutely. And I probably wouldn't have the opinions that I do now.
Right.
Yeah, so that's that in summary. Was there anything else you wanted to lay out from that? Oh, he also talked about syllogisms as well. Did you want to mention anything about syllogisms and how they work, or shall we leave that for another time?
No, that wasn't me. That was someone else.
Oh yeah, that's right. Somebody on the chat thing asked about syllogisms, but he mentioned it because he gave the dogs are animals, Fido is dog. So he gave an example of what a syllogism is.
Yeah, as far as I could tell, he got most of that right. His burden of proof stuff is a little iffy, but we'll have to wait till we get more into that before.
Yes, I wrote some notes about that because on the burden of proof thing, he opened up about. I didn't write down who it was that he was quoting, but he quoted somebody as saying that we who are atheists are also atheists and chocolate teapotists and other things like that. And if you want us to take seriously your claim, then you need to provide the evidence for us to believe it. Therefore, the burden of proof is on you. And he said. He sweepingly said that he kind of accepted that, but then he also followed up by saying that statement contains a false syllogism. But he didn't expand on that and didn't say what it was. He just said it and then moved on. And I was going, well, where is it? If you can't say something like that and then you leave us hanging, because somebody's going to come away from this call. They're going to have heard that pull out, gone, you can't say things like that. Make me believe it, because so and so said it's a false syllogism. But how is it? Demonstrate it. Explain it, please.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of where it would be, and it wouldn't even be a false syllogism, is that he was assuming that atheism was the positive claim that God didn't exist. That's the only way I could even get it close to what he was saying, but I don't know. We'd have to ask him at some point, maybe when you get him onto the show.
I will definitely do that. You're going to have to bug me for that, and you probably will. But yeah, I suspect he probably was having that kind of position where he was taking the atheist to be the hard atheist position, and he was seeing them as giving this kind of atheistic, atipotist, atheriist kind of thing as being the position that they don't actually hold.
Right. And if that's the case, then yeah, anyone who says God definitely doesn't exist, they're making a positive claim, and they definitely have a burden of proof. So
yes, although what I sometimes respond to that kind of comment as saying that the proof that God doesn't exist is your failure to provide proof that he does, and until you do that, I am very comfortable and within my rights to maintain that he doesn't. Is that a good response to that kind of comment?
I don't know if it's a good response, but it's one I tend to take as well. I figure if we can not believe in Zeus because no one's given any demonstration that he's real, then we can do the same thing for the Christian God.
Okay, Frago. Well, when we get him on, let's try that on him and see what we get, because it might be interesting to see what his response does. The other thing I want to pull out that he said was he compared the existence of a creator to a head or tails coin toss. He says you only have the two options. If you toss a coin, there are only one of two options that you can get from that. And the universe having a creator or not having a creator are the only two options available to you. Is that a reasonable comparison, do you think?
I don't know. It intuitively it sounds right, but only if you assume that creator doesn't actually have to be a person.
Mm-hmm.
For example, quantum foam is an uncaused cause for the universe. Under that dichotomy, it is a creator that's creating the universe. Something like loop quantum gravity, where you've got the expansion and crunch,
Mm-hmm.
it might be considered a creator if the crunch creates the next universe, but it also might be an uncaused universe. So I'm not entirely sure. I guess we'd have to really figure out what the definitions are before I can make a.
Yeah, I'd like to also, sorry, I'll rephrase that. I suspect that there's a bit of a slippery definition going on here, because we're going to end up at risk of infinite regress on this kind of thing, because this is okay if we're in a cyclic universe where we're having a crunch and then a recreation of the next universe, well then surely something must have got all of that going, and he'll just fall back to his intuitive feeling that has to be a creator being. And of course he didn't, when he made that comparison to a coin toss, he was very careful. He'd been talking about the Christian God, but then when he got to the comparison of the coin toss, he didn't say the Christian God, he just said a creator. Right. It was very careful in the sentence that he said, because I was trying to type down as quickly as I could what was being said. And we all know what he means by a creator. He means the Christian God, and he means his Christian God. So that is going to be the ultimate one that we land on. But he didn't say Christian God in his example. He said a creator, which leaves it open for any kind of theistic being that you want to imagine. But then you've got which one do you choose from there?
Yeah, and I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how because I know we've got Justin Brierley on the next one. Do you know if he's actually going to be part of in the peanut gallery while that happens, or is?
I hope so. I hope so. Justin has tweeted that he's contributed to 2 sessions on this course. And they did say at the end of it that Justin will be on next week and it'll be talking about space. So I'm going to make a prediction, and you heard it here first. We're going to have some kind of modification, or maybe even his original DICE video.
Yeah, I would be surprised if it's not like that. And the problem, well, we can probably cover that later, but the biggest problem with that analogy is that they're making a lot of assumptions that they can't demonstrate are accurate assumptions to be making.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be interesting to see how that comes out.
Yes, it will be. Okay, cool. Well, thanks for that, Darren. This, obviously, I'll do something with this recording. I'll keep it safe, and we'll stitch most of them all together in something resembling a coherent manner. All right.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if my initial prediction to you in the comments comes true.
We need to do that. We need to do these on the recording, actually, so that we can see how our predictions come through. Because you did. So let's do that, and I'll rejig this all. So you made a prediction to me in the comments right at the beginning that when talking about evidence for God, there won't actually be any evidence for God rolled out. That was kind of what you said, and you challenged me to a bet, didn't you?
Yeah, it's given what he stated is sort of the path going forward. Given what I know about the normal apologetics for that, my guess is that he's going to quickly lose his desire for evidence as he starts presenting his arguments for God.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for that, Darren. I need to shoot off to bed. We'll catch up again next week. But on balance, I found this to be better quality than Alpha. And so I'm looking forward to the next 7 weeks.
Yeah, and I think this was their first year they did it, right?
I'll need to double check. They've done something different previously because there are some videos of talks on their website, and I know NT Wright features in one of them. But I need to go back and redo them. I purposely didn't watch them because I did wonder if it might be the same material as we're seeing online, but I don't think it is. So I'm going to go back onto their website and watch those videos at some point. But they have done something else, but I don't think they've done this format.
Yeah, if nothing else, I like Paul better than I like the other guy.
Nicky Gumbel.
Yeah.
Yes, I think I do too. I think there's a bit more meat to the things that are being said. And I like there's going to be different people as well. I didn't realize it was going to be different people each time. So I'm liking that.
Yeah. One of my questions to him today was if he's ever going to present evidence that the immaterial is a real thing. It'll be interesting to see if he takes me up on that.
Yeah. Cheers, Darren. Until next time.
Yeah, bye.
Hey guys, it's Matthew and Darren back again. We've just come off our second Genexis evening of video and discussion and chat on Zoom. I say video, it was really presentation. This time it was the very well-known Justin Brierley, and he was answering the question, what about all the stuff? Now, those of you who listen to Justin's podcast, Unbelievable, or have read his book, also called Unbelievable, you'll maybe be familiar with our own product. At least I hope you're familiar with our own products named Still Unbelievable in companion to them, or even in opposition if you want to take that. So none of this was particularly alien to Darren and myself, but we've come off it. Andrew has joined the line. He wasn't on the Zoom, but he's curious, so he wants to know what we have to say about it, and he may ask some questions. So I think I just want to go out and just run this in a similar format to the last bit that we did, 20 minutes. Now do something about editing it all together. So Darren, any thoughts, any takeaway bits from this? Was it as you expected? Was there a surprise?
No real surprises. It's basically asking the question, why is there something rather than nothing? For some reason, theists always seem to be really impressed with this question as if it was very deep and fundamental, but they never seem to ask themselves, why is there a God rather than nothing? And if they're going to be asking, why is there something rather than nothing, it seems like God would be put in there somehow, but they always want to use God as the excuse as to why there's something rather than nothing without actually taking a step back and figuring out why there's a God rather than nothing.
Yes, and that came right at the very end in the question time session. It was the final question, wasn't it, that was asked of Justin about what made God, and how do you explain God? And I think somebody put in the comments, if you're going to say there had to be something that caused Big Bang, then by extension you must also say there must have been something that caused God. So Justin did attack that question. It's an answer that we've heard on his podcast before. I don't think it's an answer that particularly explains much, but it is an acknowledgement of some of the difficulties around there. And Justin rightly says, if you're going to go through this whole thing of something was before something, you have to stop somewhere. And he used the analogy of children's building blocks on top of a table. And that works in the world in the universe as we look at it now. My objection to that answer is it's an answer that only works if time is linear, and we're in a universe that isn't linear. As we go back towards the beginning of the universe, things behave differently. Time becomes obviously a part of the nature of the physicality of the universe that we're in. And because time is encapsulated within the universe that we're in, we get to a problem when we get to the beginning. And so that's when the analogy of the building blocks falls apart. And Justin's answer didn't acknowledge that difficulty whatsoever.
Yeah, there was also the problem with just the analogy. His entire thing with saying God was the beginning of everything was just because he needed a beginning and he was going to stop with God. The problem with that is that you don't actually have to stop with God. You can stop with the universe. That's right before it. I mean, God is completely superfluous to the whole thing. And it also has a problem that it requires a theory of time to be true, which we know it's not. So if you're talking, they don't really call it A and B theory anymore, but if you are talking B theory time, which is what relativity is, then there was no beginning to the universe. There was just a first time in the universe, first moment in time. So he brought up the cosmological argument, and which is completely predicated on the A theory of time. And so I think that whole line of reasoning, fallacious, just obviously. And the problem is they use that as the first step of the cumulative case, which means if the first step falls apart, the whole tower is crumbling down.
Yeah, and very interestingly, one of the Christians on my group is a physicist, and she studies all this kind of stuff, and she's been to CERN and seen and met and spoken to quite a large number of the world's cosmologists and physicists. So I said, I'm really curious, what is it about the Kalam? Do you buy the Kalam? What is your response to seeing the Kalam? And the first thing was, she surprised me. She said it was the first time she'd ever heard the Kalam cosmological argument, which I know I really didn't know how to respond to that. Anyway, I said to her, what do you think about it? And she looked at it and she goes, yeah, that number 2, that's a bit of a problem, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of is. And the worst thing is that William Lane Craig is sort of the proponent he's the one that's popularized it. And every single time he goes on a debate with a physicist, they always tell him he's wrong. And they point out exactly how and why he's wrong. And yet he still is constantly repeating that. So I have no clue why, but...
For the listeners, maybe it would be worth just restating the Kalam very quickly. William Lane Craig's version of the Kalam is everything that began to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. So the second premise, number 2 there, is the universe began to exist. That would be the second premise for those who just can't rattle the Kalam off in their head.
Right, and that's actually just the first part of Craig's Kalam argument. The second part is less deductive and more of an assertion that the cause has to be immaterial, timeless, massless, personal agent. And so that's the second part of that, because if you just take the first part of it, you can grant every single thing, and that doesn't get you any closer to a god.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, I was just going to say that Craig's been doing that for decades, hasn't he? Pumping this argument out.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's completely based on a theory of time. Although I noticed someone in the chat said that he had walked back from that recently, but the last podcast I heard him on, just last month, I think, he was still very much saying that it was the A theory of time. So I'm not entirely sure what his new argument for that might be now.
Okay. Well, we've got some time before this gets published live, so at some point maybe somebody can try and get some research on it. I'll see what I can find about that. It'll be interesting to see but if that is true, he's got an awful lot of videos and podcasts to go and revisit and to take down.
Right.
I almost would like to ask William Lane Craig in a questions and answers session, does God exist? So everything that began to exist has a cause. Now,
I think
there are
it's
two
began
ways
to exist. Yeah, he'll deny that God began to exist.
Yeah, that's what William Lane Craig actually fixed with the argument, because it used to be anything that exists has a cause. William Lane Craig changed it to be anything that begins to exist has a cause. And since God didn't begin to exist, that means he doesn't need a cause.
Yeah, but I think you can read that premise the other way around, though, right? So I agree that that's one way to read it. The other way to read it is to simply say that those things that don't begin to exist don't exist. So you sort of have to say, if God didn't begin to exist, how can you say that he does exist at all? There is a way to argue that first premise, because it almost seems nonsensical to suggest, without something like cyclic cosmology, that something doesn't have So you've got the same problem with a God, Darren. I think you said this up front. You've got the same problem with a God that you would have with the universe. And I'm not sure that the first premise of the Kalam sort of gets you out of that.
Yeah, it's one of those things where something has to be necessary. As far as I can tell, reality is the only thing that has to be necessary, because if you don't have reality, then you have, well, literally nothing. And I'm not entirely sure that nothing is even a coherent state. So I'm not entirely sure you can have nothing, which means that you have to have something that's always existed.
Something may not have a logical opposite that is nothing.
Right.
Yeah, it's like love and hate aren't necessarily opposites. You know, there's ambiguity or whatever the right word is there that is probably the opposite. But anyway, yeah. So Tony, was there any surprises for you in the presentation from Justin?
No, I think it was just the same old, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's pretty much what we all thought as well. I think we've all spent enough time around Justin's podcast and his book that we know what's coming.
Yeah. I was shaking my head most of the time I was listening to it, I think.
Yeah, and there was some quite lively comments coming up through the chat as well. It was nice to see the chat window more busy than it was last week with Paul.
I think part of that was people didn't realize they could actually put things in chat and people would see it.
Yeah.
The lady physicist that's in your group, there was sort of a teaser that you left out. You said that maybe this week with you guys was the first time she'd heard the Kalam cosmological argument, but she is a Christian, right? So
yes.
Did she have the opportunity, beyond saying this is the first time I've heard the Kalam, to say what as a physicist convinced her that there was a God?
She did touch on that a little bit earlier on in the group time, and her knowledge that mathematics so wonderfully and so perfectly explains so much of what we have, whether it's on the big or whether it's on the tiny, and the beautiful organization with which it is all laid out. And it was effectively a sophisticated argument from incredulity, if I'm really honest. That's the way it came across to me, that everything is so wonderful, so perfect, and it fits so well together, and it can be explained and it can be understood. There really must be something bigger behind it, because it can't just happen like that.
So a version of the fine-tuning argument. Right.
And would she be happier if it weren't explainable?
Well, yeah, I know. I think if she's still around, if she hangs around for another session, I think I'm going to send her a private message and say, can I have you on to Still Unbelievable? I'd love to talk with you. But by the time this goes out, I'll have probably done it, and you will all know the answer to that question. But I think she'll be really genuinely interesting to talk to, because I'd like to feedback and push back on that specific assertion, but the time that we've got in the group time just doesn't really allow to unpack that kind of thing to any kind of detail. And I don't want to dominate the whole 15 minutes that we have on just one subject.
Right. And I'm not trying to increase the time for this week, because you guys have been good about keeping it narrow. I thought, man, I didn't get to listen to what you guys were saying, and there's like a loose end there that felt really interesting. So thank you.
And there was something else that Justin brought out on this subject, and that was he brought up the BGV theorem as well. And you mentioned that there is one of them that says the universe had a beginning, but there is also one of them that says maybe not. So he did acknowledge that BGV doesn't necessarily solve the problem for anybody either, even though he brought up, which was nice to hear, because all too often Christians forget that there is somebody else with another opinion in BGV.
Yeah, well, the biggest problem I saw with that line of reasoning is that they're assuming that the universe is all a physical reality, which is how the Kalam gets started, because they're assuming that there was nothing and then there was something, and that the BGB verifies that there was nothing and then there was something, which it doesn't actually do. Because the Big Bang Theory, it's just that. It's just a theory that says that the expansion of the universe started. It doesn't say anything about what was before it or anything. And that that is the biggest problem with this kind of argumentation, is because they take universe to mean all of physical reality when it doesn't actually mean that.
Mm. And yeah, that's a good point, actually, because there was a question from the physicist lady on my group, and this helps us just change tack a little bit, and it was on the subject of naturalism. And her question to me was, well, the universe is really only 5% of matter, of stuff that we know. If you're a naturalist, how do you explain all of that other stuff? And I said, well, it's still just natural, really, isn't it? Just because we can't fully understand it or fully measure it or fully explain it doesn't mean that it's not natural. It just came from the Big Bang, and it's a natural event. So, and she accepted that as an answer. But again, that will be something that's interesting to unpack.
That only goes part way, doesn't it? Because it's not as if dark matter and dark energy are just words that we throw around without any sort of experimental verification, right? And so we know that about 5% of our universe is classic matter. Protons, neutrons, and electrons doing what protons, neutrons, and electrons do. The stuff that we're made of, right? But we know that about 5% of the universe is made up of matter, classic matter, not because of anything other than we can see things like the dark matter halo and between galaxies, that kind of thing, right? It's not as if there is nothing there. It's not as if this is some kind of very strange number that somebody just conjured and said, oh, well, I think there's 95% of a universe that we don't interact with, right? We have good reasons to think that dark matter and dark matter and dark energy exist. And that 5% is not some weak number that we just sort of made up, right? And so with that knowledge, you can reasonably push back and say, how do you think it is that we come up with that 5% measurement? We don't come up with that 5% measurement in the same way that we come up with maybe there's a God, right? Because we don't say, well, God makes up 95% of the universe and 5% of it is classic matter. So clearly we've got more to go on in regard to dark matter and dark energy than we do some investigation of a hypothetical God.
Any other thoughts before I move on to the naturalist versus the non-naturalist?
Not for me.
No, okay. Because that was the other main thrust of this evening's conversation, and Justin touched on a bit about, and he laid it out as atheist naturalist versus Christian theists. And the naturalist has no cause for everything, and there is no ultimate meaning, there is no purpose to the universe. And Justin even went further and said on his view that he sees things as truth, as being something that is a thing. It might not be natural, it's immaterial, but it is something that is real, something that exists. Same with right and wrong. And I, as a naturalist and as somebody who's not a Christian, I reject that concept completely. But he did put it out in the latter part of his talk about the atheist naturalist versus the supernatural Christian. So anyone want to give any thoughts on that part of Justin's talk?
I always wondered how they account for calculators. I mean, because calculators are all material, right? They produce true answers. I mean, doesn't that go against their whole spiel of matter can't produce true answers?
Well, it's because God is in there somewhere. If it was a natural universe without God, then the calculator clearly wouldn't work. I'd never really engaged that argument. I'd love to unpack it with someone, but I just don't engage with it. I just don't see how it works. I don't see how they can even say it with a straight face, if I'm really honest.
Well, Andrew, you've heard it here first. Calculators have free will.
Ooh.
Okay. So that was very, very well played, and and I'm just going to pretend like you didn't say it and ask the next question. So here's the thing that always puzzles me, and I just wonder how you guys feel about it, having listened to Justin. And it seems like maybe I need to start joining these things. Okay, so it bothers me when we say, if there's not God, the universe doesn't have a purpose. Well, it seems to me that there's some kind of conflation here that happens pretty regularly. I don't see why the universe has to have a purpose for any of us to have a self-directed purpose. Now, I realize Christians aren't happy with self-directed purpose, but you guys were in the lecture, and I just wonder whether this sort of self-directed purpose idea came up and whether there was any pushback on it, because I feel like, first of all, I'm not sure I'm a part of the universe in any sort of puzzle sense, right? Like it's some kind of cosmic jigsaw puzzle, and somehow I'm part of it. I agree that I'm in the universe. I'm made of classic matter and all that sort of thing. But why is there a conflation, if there is, or if you guys heard it this way? Why is there a conflation between the universe having a purpose and that having some implication about individual purpose?
I think it's mostly wishful thinking, and maybe that's too harsh of a word, but it's more of people want to have meaning in their lives. So if they don't think that they have meaning in their lives, then it feels nihilistic to them or something like that. And then the only way they can figure out how to have meaning in their lives is if someone tells them what that meaning is. I don't know.
It's so sad.
It's
so sad.
And I'm kind of guessing here because I'm only going off of sort of what my group was saying on the subject. So it was all basically, well, I some form of, I wouldn't want to live in a universe without purpose.
Matthew, did you have a different set of interactions in your group? Because
we didn't touch the naturalist a bit because we talked more around the beginning of the universe and that kind of thing. It would be really great to unpack a bit more about the purpose and how that comes, because again, this is a great subject which I would absolutely love to explore in greater detail, because I just don't get this whole, I don't see why it's attractive to have a universe with purpose and then a supernatural deity telling me what I need to do with my life as if I'm incapable of finding my own purpose. Anyway, I find it really weak and depressing, if I'm really honest, and almost pitiful. You know, I have a pet dog and I have chickens in my garden. You know, I give them a purpose to be my entertainment or to be my sustenance. I don't want to be that for any other greater being. I want to be my own. I want to be have control and have some autonomy in my own life and in my own being. And I much prefer having a family which gives me purpose, and having a job which gives me purpose, and having a home that I enjoy which gives me purpose. They might sound small and twee and materialistic, but they're absolutely important, fundamentally important to me, because they are the places where I spend my daily life, and they are the things that which the immediate happiness of my life depends on. And I'm very, very happy deciding from those things at any moment in time which is the most important and which gives me purpose when I get up in the morning. I don't see why I need anything else to project onto me what meaning my life needs to have.
So totally agree. And I missed the mailer. I don't know if you guys got yours, but I don't have a God giving me purpose as far as I can tell. I mean, I know that there's that bit in Ecclesiastes, right? The whole purpose of man is to fear God and keep his commandments, or wherever it is in the Old Testament. But I never have actually felt like that was to me in any real sense. It's just a thing written in a book, right? And so if the cosmic creator has a purpose for me, he failed to tell me what it was. So broken atheist or whatever, but
well, I think Thor was fairly clear about what he wants. He wants the soldiers to fight in Ragnarok.
So look, if I can have superpowers, I'm so there. So there. So you guys had an interesting time. Thank you for letting me participate with you. I feel like there's probably other things that y'all need to get around to, but what an interesting conversation. And did you say that Justin's doing next week's as well?
He's doing next week's as well, fine-tuning next week. So he's doing next week's as well.
Wow. Okay.
Darren and I have got a recording with Paul in 2 days' time, which is going to be great. Really looking forward to that. He's the guy last week's one.
Right. A lawyer, maybe? Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, he's a lawyer. QC.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how what he feels about Justin's arguments, because he's very much an evidentialist type of guy.
So I want to ask you guys to remember this, and I will say it here for the listeners, and maybe somebody will get to ask this question on Wednesday. Matthew, I think I've said it to you before. There's a big push for Christians to come up with sort of common sense evidence, the sort of evidence that you and I would accept every day that would pass courtroom muster as evidence, right? So how do we get to a God, right? And I think there's a really interesting problem in U.S. law. Christians have created apologetics firm after apologetics firm after apologetics firm, talking about reasonable evidence for God. And here's what I want to know. Why is it then in the United States that a defendant in a case, in some kind of crime, can't walk into a court and through his lawyer simply say, God made me do it?
Yeah. That's not allowed. It's strictly barred. Spectral evidence is not considered evidence in the court of law. Hasn't been since the witch trials.
I don't mean to be snarky or anything like it. I am really curious whether a practicing lawyer has an answer for that kind of question. I don't know if the conversation will go that way where you get to ask it, but if you do, I'd love to hear one of you ask him, because it really is an important question to me in regard to this idea that from a legal perspective, there's enough evidence for a God.
It's actually an interesting question. I'll see if I can remember to
It is an interesting question. The more I think it through, the more I think, actually there is a really interesting discussion that can be had around that. My biggest concern is asking it without sounding obtuse, because I think actually if it can be asked in the context of the conversation that we're having, I think some really interesting thoughts can be had around the question.
Then you should not have me there Wednesday. I can't ask him. See, it sounds bad even when I ask it here, right? I mean,
yeah, we may need Matthew to ask it. It's going to require a UK accent. I don't know if my American accent will be able to do it justice.
No matter, see, you can't
nicely
ask
batted,
it.
Guys. Nicely batted.
Well, it's true, but see, no matter what he says when Darren asks it, Darren is going to go for the jugular in the second response. So,
yeah.
Darren's going to eviscerate him. It'll look like one of those Wolverine comics,
I want. Don't make me
I just ask the questions. It's not my fault that Christians feel that asking them reasonable questions is somehow persecution.
Right. Talking of questions, back to the girl in my group who's a physicist, she said there's a question that she's asked every physicist that she's ever met, and she gets the same answer every time. That's a really interesting question. I don't know. And she's desperate for somebody to be able to ask it for her. So I'm not going to put any pressure on you guys thinking that you might be able to answer, but it'd be interesting to see what your response to the question is anyway. So her question is, we have the cosmic microwave background from the echoes of the Big Bang. What happens to our universe when those echoes degrade further and it goes from being microwave to radio?
I think they already are radio, right? Isn't that what we use to look at it, the radio telescopes?
Yeah, but in the microwave band, right?
Yeah, so... Yeah, because actually, good point that, because I've heard it described as it's the static between stations on our radio set, which means it is radio. So why are we calling it microwave?
Well, it's because
I'm going to
have to.
I'm going to have to push back on that next week when I'm talk to her.
So
Well,
I suspect that the answer. Sorry, Darren, go ahead.
I was just going to clarify for Matthew. It's because the entire electromagnetic spectrum is all light. It's just light at different wavelengths.
Yeah.
So radio, microwave, all that, it's all light.
Yeah, it is all light. Yes, I know that. So
Um,
okay. So it's just interference. It's not frequency. Okay.
Well, and that was going to be exactly what I said. So the cosmic microwave background is something that I'm not positive about this. I have to ask physicists, but I think we're pretty well shielded from the CMB just through Earth's atmosphere, right? And so I'm not sure that even if it degraded into radio frequency in the sense of an AM or FM kind of signal, right? I'm not sure that we would notice. But even if we did, we're all three of us are familiar with signal processing, and so it would have to be quite a strong noise, right? We call it background for a reason, and it's because it's hard to detect, right? And so unless that degrading, however she visualizes it, unless that degrading also includes some sort of amplification that would cause higher interference than what the CMB causes for other equipment that operates in that band right now, I think the answer is nothing.
Well, now, if I remember correctly, you said that her question was, what happens when it turns into the microwave frequency?
No, from the microwave, when it goes from the microwave into the radio.
Okay. So she's thinking of like a huge radio jammer that just takes out the entire universe or something like that?
Well, yeah, it's a curious question. I think one, because obviously what happens is the radio waves they change as they lose energy. Presumably the frequency or the wavelength changes, which is why it goes from microwave to radio, because presumably it used to be light. So the radio waves are presumably getting further and further apart as the energy gets lost. Grums, I hope I'm not betraying myself as being really, really dim. I'm going to have to fact check these and then decide to cut this whole section out.
Yeah, I just don't know enough about all that to really make a intelligent comment on it.
No, and I wasn't necessarily expecting you to. If she's asked this question of Brian Cox, or Brian Cox said, "Really interesting," I'd love to know the answer myself. So,
right.
So I don't know how the three of us could even come up with anything that's even remotely coherent if the great His Lordship Brian Cox wouldn't give the answer.
So I will just go out on a limb and point out that any radio signal we have has two properties: organization and signal power. And I don't know. So the CMB comes down into something like 108 megahertz, right? So it gets down into FM radio range. And what sort of signal power are we talking about? It's still a background.
Yeah.
It's not like it is being broadcast.
But it's everywhere, though, isn't it? So I guess there's a question there on if it's everywhere, is there a point where it gets to a frequency or a wavelength or whatever where it actually reacts to the fabric or the function of the universe in some fundamental way which we can't comprehend now? There's a big picture question here, I think.
Yeah, so I agree that there's a big picture question here. That's actually what I'm going after, because we do have equipment that operates up in the microwave band. We've got all kinds of equipment that operates above gigahertz, up into thousands of gigahertz. And what we don't see is some place where we say, we bumped into the cosmic microwave background band and our equipment stopped working.
Yeah, I'm sort of with Andrew there. I think given the amount of energy that's required for like the LHC, I don't know that the radio waves will actually have any serious input on on the universe as a whole.
Here's another question.
Yeah, and that's presumably a very valid answer. It's interesting question. Nothing.
So, right. So I wonder this. I have no idea, and she could probably answer, and it'd be worth asking. How long will it take for the CMB at its current frequency, if it degrades in the kind of way that we're all conjecturing based on the understanding of how she asked the question? So there's a long chain here, but I kind of wonder how long will that take, right? Because if it's longer than 2 billion years or whatever, we're not going to be here to know the answer.
No.
Good old Saul is going to come out and swallow us up. Are we talking about a degrading of signal in the kind of very long time frames of the universe where when it becomes an issue, all stars will have burned out? Anyway.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either.
Any last thoughts of anything else that came out of tonight's Genexis session that we haven't pontificated on?
No, the only big thing that I had a question was he's trying to compare two options, the supernatural and the natural. And he went over a lot of the natural and what it's doing, but I didn't hear anything about the supernatural, what it was doing, what it's capable of, anything like that. So
it's a very similar criticism to what we did on last week's, where it was the measuring evidence and how do we define evidence, and the example was something that's very natural, and we were sitting there waiting for some comparator to tell us how we can use that on the supernatural, and it never came.
Yeah, and the fine-tuning argument, it's very emblematic of that, because they'll say that the fine-tuning is so improbable that it couldn't have been done naturally, but they never give us what the probability is for it happening supernaturally would be, which means there's no way to actually compare the two.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if this is going to be a theme, but we'll have to attend the rest and find out. No spoilers here.
Well, and for that I blame you.
Yes, it's all my fault. I only do it so people will love me.
But
I need a purpose. Please
it's impossible to love a Brit. It's not. It's just. That's why you guys get all the best bad guy roles in the movies, right?
Are you kidding? If I ever have a child, I'm moving to England so that they grow up with an English accent.
Excellent.
I'm moving just so they grow up in a country without Donald Trump.
You do realize that...
Sorry.
No, that's a valid reason. I'm good with that.
Yeah. The thing is, the trouble with moving to England is you're now closer to France.
I'm okay with France. They've got Cap d'Agde there, so I'm good with France.
They've got what?
Cap d'Agde. It's basically a nudist city.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
Right. But you're also that much closer to Germany.
We are. All those cars.
Hey, guys, thank you for letting me join you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, this is divulged. We need to move on, and I got to go to bed. Thanks for another session, guys. And for next week, as we've already said, it's going to be Justin doing the fine-tuning argument. We'll probably give it exactly the same treatment as you've just heard in this section, but just stay around and listen anyway. Thank you, both of you. Right, so this is Matthew and Darren, and we've just had session 3 of the Genexis course. So this is Justin doing his talk on fine-tuning. I think it was subtitled Goldilocks, Puddles and Firing Squads. Maybe we'll explain what those came from. Darren and I have just been chuckling for a couple of seconds, so I thought I'd hit record and get going. I don't know if Tony and Andrew are going to be able to join us to have this conversation, but we'll get chatting away and go anyway. So Darren and I were just talking about, there was one quite vocal atheist on the group who, in my group and also in the chat forum, it was the same individual, who didn't appreciate the discussion, the presentation at all, didn't appreciate what Justin was saying, thought he was quite wrong on some of the assertions he was making, and he really quite forcefully made the point that we shouldn't be having a person who's effectively a radio presenter
presenting a subject like this, we need somebody who knows a lot more about what they're saying and can talk with a lot more confidence on the subject matter. And there seemed to be quite a bit of sympathy with that point of view. And Darren, you were just saying that you made a similar point quite forcefully on your subgroup.
No, I didn't make the same point, but I wholeheartedly agreed with it.
Right.
Yeah, no, I was just saying that I'm probably the versifus for, anyways, it's pretty much just me speaking in our group, just because the person that runs it pretty much just asked the questions at me. And I paused long enough to make sure no one else wants to jump in, but no one else ever seems to want to jump in. So they're apparently happy just to listen to the conversation between me and the group leader.
Okay. Are you the only atheist, or are you the only one who's just prepared to fly it so enthusiastically?
Oh, I'm the only atheist.
Are you really? Okay. In a group of how many?
We started out with 6,
right,
including the narrator, but we're down to 4.
And
I don't know if that was, and I don't know if that's a permanent decrease or if the others will be coming back later on. But yeah, that's.
We were just 4 in my group in the pre-presentation chat, but then it went back up to about 8, I think. So I really prefer it when it's a bigger group, but there were still a couple that didn't talk. But the thing that really intrigued me was they were basically unanimous in that they were disappointed with the presentation. So I'm including the Christians in that. Nobody said they thought the presentation was great. They all felt that it was quite poor. They pretty much agreed with the not having a scientist present this subject and argue for this subject was quite poor. And although they may not have said it, I kind of got the impression that they felt that Justin didn't do it the justice that it deserved. And so there was a little bit of talk about last year's Genexis courses, which were in I want to say Coventry Cathedral. I don't know if it was Coventry. I thought it was London. But anyway, they were presented in the cathedral last year, and they had various big names. And one of the names that came out was Ard Louis, who, for the listeners, I don't know what order these things are going to come out. They will have probably already heard Paul's interview before they hear this. But Darren and I have already had a conversation with Paul Downs from Genexis where Paul mentioned Ard Louis on that, and there was somebody else, Paul Davies, I think, who was also did a presentation. He's also qualified in the matter. He did a decent presentation. The videos for both of those talks are on the Genexis website. So I think those Christians that saw that, and then they had the presentation that we've just had from Justin, I think for them it was a real disappointment. So shall we go through some of the points then, Darren? I'm figuring this might be a shorter discussion because there's not a huge amount to say and there's fewer of us. Do you have any, other than you didn't appreciate it, or sorry, you thought it was pretty bad, do you have any other specific thoughts that you want to bring out from it?
Not at the moment. When we go through all the points, I'm sure they'll come out, because most of it, if anyone's seen Justin's DICE video, that's pretty much what he went over in this.
Yes, so so I recorded it last time that we would expect to see the DICE video. I thought he might actually be brave or rather be cheeky and just play the DICE video, but he didn't. He presented it as a talking head. Although he didn't go through all of the DICE video, he did open it up with the DICE thing and he gave those same numbers about the DICE thing. So he did that, and he asked this question, why is the universe so fine-tuned? Did it just get lucky? And of course, that question, did it just get lucky, is a rhetorical question. The suggestion is that it can't have just got lucky. That's just too improbable. We've got, so therefore, and that's used as a springboard to move to God. And that really is how you boil down this talk, is it's too improbable that the universe could have ended up like this on a mere roll of a dice. So therefore, something must have arranged it. And there's an analogy which I really like on that, and that's a deck of cards. And I don't have the maths and the numbers, and I haven't checked them, so feel free to check them. But I have heard it said that the number of possible combinations of a deck of cards is so great that every time you shuffle the deck of playing cards, you end up with a combination of cards that has never before been dealt. And so every time you shuffle a deck of cards, what you get is a probability that is really, really minute, and you do it every single time. Yeah. And I think that's the way the universe is. However the universe was going to end up, it was going to end up
And
Yeah. My biggest problem with the whole thing is that they special plead God out of claiming that the universe is so fine-tuned so it demands an explanation, and then they say that anything that created the universe would have to be just as fine-tuned, for example, a multiverse. And then when you ask, okay, so how did God get fine-tuned because he supposedly created the universe, then they special plead out of it saying, oh, well, we just defined God as not needing an explanation. So, nah.
and we need to single you out on that one, because you asked that question, and then that question got asked to Justin by Ben, the presenter, the guy who was hosting us this evening, because I don't think Paul could make it. Wasn't he doing an alpha course? I think that's what he said when we spoke to him last week, wasn't it? So he said he probably wouldn't be on the quarter. So anyway, but what that means, dear listeners, is Darren has just won himself a signed copy of Justin's book. Unbelievable. Why, after 10 years of talking with atheists, he's still a Christian. And I bet you're looking forward to that.
Oh, I didn't even. I think I had to claim it, and I didn't even bother. One, I've already got the book, and two, I'm getting rid of all my physical books, so I don't want another one.
You can donate it to someone. I know the person who was fronting my small group said that he was supposed to have had a copy of the book but didn't. So if we can find a way to donate it to him, I'm sure that would be appreciated. So email Ben and say, feel free to donate my book to someone.
I don't know. Do I really want to be complicit in the lowering of someone's IQ? That seems.
This guy is a man
of
the cloth already, so. But yeah, it could be someone else. And anyway, I did waive my copy of the book I got Justin to sign my copy of the book when I bought it, because I went and saw him in London at the Unbelievable conference when he formally launched the book. And mine's got lots of red pen marks on various pages through it where I don't agree with what he said. So I like to make that point, that I've got a signed copy of his book and I've got lots of red pen scribbles all over it. Anyway, so that's my story about my book. And going back to the fine-tuning thing, there is another explanation of these numbers, because Justin really laid it in on the power, on the gravity number. That's what one of the Christians in my group said. Why did he just pick on gravity? There's lots of numbers. You know, what's so special about the gravity number? But Justin did single out the gravity number, and there's a calculation. I think it's the odds. It's a 1 to the power of 10 to lots of zeros.
28, I think.
28 zeros. It's a really big number, and I think it says the odds of this number is the equivalent to rolling a 6 80 times in a row. Unlikely to happen. And there's a context. This is the point I made in my small group, and I'm sure I'm copying this from somewhere else. I'm pretty sure I didn't make this up on my own. Somebody else has said this. And the rebuttal to this is there's no context to this number. You hear this really impressively, unimaginably large number, a number that is really difficult to imagine the quantity of. And it's applied to the value of gravity as a probability. But we get no context into what that actually means. And one of the ways in which this lack of context is a problem was explained to me is that if you imagine an ant, a tiny ant, and then if you add on to that the knowledge that ants come in different sizes. Now, you're going to go from the smallest ant, a couple of millimeters, to the largest ant, which possibly a couple of centimeters. And so the size difference between them is quite enormous. But you need some context into what a couple of centimeters is. If you measure it in centimeters, the number is, 2. If you measure it in miles, the number is 0.00 something. And the difference between the longest and the smallest as compared to a mile are two very tiny numbers. If you compare them to the width of an atom or the width of a human hair, the numbers suddenly become an awful lot bigger, the difference between the smallest ant and the largest ant. But you're talking about exactly the same difference. The difference in the number purely is a representation of the scale that you're using. So when a small ant looks at a big ant, it looks at something that's enormous. And when a big ant looks at a small ant, it looks at something that's tiny. If an elephant looks at both of them, it looks at two really tiny things. And if gravity is literally just the difference, if the variation in what gravity could be is literally the difference between a small ant and a big ant, scale is very important when you're talking about it. And if you're talking about the difference in sizes of ants from an elephant's perspective, the size difference is really quite minute. The amount that they move is imperceptibly different. And so that's what's really important to grasp when talking about these kind of numbers around fine-tuning and using probability to come up to a value. What's your scale? What's your comparator?
Yeah, and that's really important to take into consideration. Another thing is that the probability doesn't actually matter.
Yeah.
Because if we're talking string theory, then the chances of our universe being the way it is 10 to the 500th power, which is a lot smaller than 10 to the 28th for the gravity. And yet, under string theory, it's going to happen 100% of the time. And not only is it going to happen 100% of the time, but it's going to happen an infinite number of 100% of the time. Yeah. Which means we are having this same exact conversation in an infinite number of different universes. And then we're also don't exist in an infinite number of those universes as well. So it doesn't really matter what the percentage is, again, going back to your context thing, because if you're in the context of a multiverse, then the percentage of it happening is immaterial. And another problem is that they never give us a percentage to compare it to. So let's say it's 10 to the 28th. Well, if the probability of a god doing something is 0, then 10 to the 28th is still more probable than a god doing it, because 10 to the 28th is still bigger than 0.
Mm-hmm. We're clearly not impressed by the fine-tuning argument. I did ask the Christians on the group how they responded to the fine-tuning argument, and unfortunately we ran out of time, so we didn't really get a full answer to that. So I don't know if I'll get an opportunity to ask it again next week, because we'll probably be talking about DNA and the subject there, which incidentally I'm really looking forward to that one. We were promised a scientist, so it'll be really interesting to see who turns up for that one. So I didn't really get the opportunity to have a picture of what the Christians felt in my group, which is unfortunate. But no, the breakout time isn't a huge amount of time. There's a lot to try and cover.
Yeah, I know Jacob, he was my team leader. He was very impressed with the fine-tuning argument.
Was he?
Yeah, but it was also, and when I asked him the thing about the fine-tuning of God, he went on to say, he went on to sort of quote the Kalam cosmological argument, in that things that don't begin don't need to have a cause. So then we broke out into a discussion of B theory of time, relativity, and how the Kalam cosmological argument doesn't actually work because of what we know to be true about how time works. So we didn't really get a chance to finish that, but James is another one I wish we could get on to have a long form discussion with, because I agree these little half-hour discussion times when they're trying to get multiple questions in is not productive.
No. Is he someone, you say he's your group leader?
Mm-hmm.
Well, reach out to him if you want to do that and see if we can tempt him.
Okay. I don't know how to get a hold of him outside of the thing, but if I remember next time, I'll message him. And
do a private chat and see if we can get something going. It'll be really, really interesting if we can pull some people in to have some longer conversations on these. Because I really want to, because the point with me asking that question of my group is I wanted to see where the Christians sat, and it was really enlightening to see that they were unimpressed with Justin's presentation. So I wanted to see where they drew the line, whether it was just the presentation that they were disappointed with, because they'd seen the similar kind of subject dealt with by a scientist, or whether fine-tuning really wasn't an issue for them, and their reasons for believing God was somewhere else, or whether they did feel that part of fine-tuning was useful to them.
Sounds like you need to get your group on the microphone and do a podcast out of it.
Yeah, I'll see what we can do. I did mention, if you remember, that one of them is a cosmologist anyway, So I did reach out to her this evening. I haven't had a reply, but maybe I'll catch up with her next week and see if I can get her on, because it'll be really interesting. And if you're a Christian listening to this and you either got professional experience or professional knowledge of this matter, or you're a really keen amateur and you've gone and studied the subjects, reach out to us, reasonpress@gmail.com. Let's have that conversation, because I would really like to unpick the matter of fine-tuning with a Christian to see where it is in the fine-tuning argument that you become convinced by God, and where, when I push back on you about some of the things that we've been saying here, how far does that push you towards God, and how do you make the leap from, okay, there must have been some kind of initial force, to that initial force being the Christian God, because that's a big leap as well. Because somebody asked that question at the end as well. Isn't it a big leap to go from fine-tuning had something that started it to the Christian God, the God of the Bible? And I agree, that is quite a leap, because fine-tuning doesn't get you to the Christian God, just like the Kalam cosmological argument doesn't get you to the Christian God. You've got some work to do there. There's a bridge to build there. And what was your thoughts on how Justin answered that question?
I sort of remember what his response was. I remember it being fairly honest, that because I believe he said that you really can't make that leap, but it's sort of whatever your religion is type of thing, because he's just arguing for a creator God at this point, not
Yes, he did concede that it is a bit of a leap, but he didn't seem to want to admit that it's a really big leap, like the question suggested, which is fair enough, I guess. But yeah, he didn't resolve the issue of it being a leap, did he? And I think it's, let's grant fair dues where they're deserved, because if he's going to admit that it's a leap, then yes, there is a leap there. I don't see how it can be achieved personally. I think you have a different reason for believing the Christian God, and if you believe the Christian God, then you will believe that the Christian God is the one that sorted out fine-tuning. But I don't think you can make it back from the other direction.
I don't think Christians do a bottom-up approach for this thing. I think it's all down, top down. They start with the God, and then they try to make things fit into that hypothesis. And so I don't think that leap is a big deal for them, because they're already starting out as a Christian. I don't think it would be a big leap for like a Muslim either.
No.
Just because they would just be assuming all the arguments supported Allah as being God. And I would guess that Hindus and ancient Greek or Egyptian worshippers, I would imagine that they would all be fine with this line of arguments, and none of them would think it was a big leap just because of how they grew up.
There is something else that Justin said, which I do want to endorse, although not in the same way that he means it, and that's the universe is crying out for an explanation. And purely from a curiosity point of view, just like everything else that's within the universe, everything that we don't know anything about is crying out for an explanation. Let's go and do our best to find out what that explanation is. But let's not use that as a shortcut to seeing the universe as designed, and therefore there must have been a God that did it.
That's the part I don't get. I mean, how do you claim that the universe demands an explanation, but God doesn't? That just seems bizarre to me.
Yes, and you tried to make that point in the comments as well. And I think this may be one area where those of us who are not Christian, like you and I, and the Christian will probably never see eye to eye on. Justin answered that, I think, one of the best ways I've heard it answered by a Christian. I'm not sure it is still a proper answer, but I think it's the best answer I've heard. And that is, Justin basically said something along the lines of, you can't just go from something that's physical to something else that's physical. If all you've got is something that's physical, then you've got something that needs an explanation for its being, which is why you then need to get to the metaphysical. And I think that's how he's explaining the step from the physical to his God, or from his God to the physical, whichever direction you want to go. If you're prefixing the universe with something that is also materialistic, natural, physical, then you're only moving the problem back. As soon as you get something that's metaphysical that started it, then you're good.
But why are you good at the metaphysical? Why doesn't the metaphysical require an explanation?
I absolutely agree with you, and I think the dodge on that point is telling. Obviously, Christians would disagree with us that it's a dodge, but I don't see it any other way, really.
Well, Justin basically came out and said God is defined as not needing an explanation. So I don't know how you can dispute the dodge in that, really.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it is a bit of a cheek if you're going to define it as not needing an explanation,
I mean, if they're going
let's
to do that,
define
then I'll just define the quantum foam
quantum
as not needing an explanation, and then we don't need a God.
Yes, quite. Let's just raise it with something else that doesn't need an explanation. And who's to say, is the quantum phone actually something that's physical? Maybe the quantum phone is metaphysical. Just saying. I don't think this pushing back. And then the other difficulty, and we mentioned this briefly last time after last week's episode as well, was we've got the whole temporal element in all this as well. So I don't want to repeat all of that. So this is obviously going to affect how I edit this. But yeah, the temporal thing, as soon as you talk about things of a cause and something being before something, you've got the whole time thing. But we're talking about a period which didn't have time. And I think this gets conveniently forgotten when talking about God not needing an explanation, but the quantum phone does need an explanation.
Yeah, and I've always found that a reason to conclusively determine that God doesn't exist. How do you create time with no time with which to actually create time?
And that's why God is defined as being outside of time.
Right, but I mean, how is that any different than being a statue? Because time is what allows us to think, it allows us to move from moment to moment, it allows us to create. I mean, you can't create without time because you have two moments, one without and one with. So I have no clue how you even get to a logical, coherent statement that God created time.
I wish you hadn't said statue there, because my mind went straight to Doctor Who's Weeping Angels.
Well, sure, but I mean, because they're cool. I mean, why wouldn't you?
Because they're freaking scary. That's what.
That's on you. If you want to compare God to a weeping angel, I'm happy to do that.
That's a God that I'm frightfully scared of. A God I absolutely fear with every molecule of my being. I think we've hit the drain. So we've pulled it apart. I think, in summary, I'm disappointed. And the other point that I made in my group time about being disappointed by this is I've been familiar with this argument in this video of Justin's for a couple of years, and I'm familiar with the criticisms that it's had already. And the presentation that Justin gave wasn't sufficiently different from what he gave, and the criticisms that his original DICE video got a couple of years ago are the same criticisms that are appropriate for the talk that he did now. Things need to be moved on. We can't regurgitate the same talk and then hear the same criticisms and then have the same conversation. Can we have something that moves these dialogues on a little bit?
I don't think we can. I don't think it's possible for the theists because they have no way to distinguish fact from fiction. They're stuck with whatever idea they happen to have, and if it supports their narrative, then they're happy to regurgitate it for 2,000 years or so, and no matter what the problems are. And if it doesn't, then they're happy to discount it. But to actually move forward, I don't think it's possible because they have no way to move forward.
Yeah, I got nothing to add to that, really. The next session is going to be much more interested. I'm genuinely looking forward to what's going to be said about DNA. I hope we're not going to get it so complicated it's a code, therefore God. But I'm hopeful that we're going to get something better than that.
Oh, I guarantee you we're going to get its code. Information, the code, yeah.
Okay. We weren't given a name, so we can't do any research in the next week, but we can certainly see what some Christians are saying. We might be able to guess at who it might be, but let's find out next week. I was really glad not to see the DNA as a code analogy thrown out.
Oh yeah, that threw me that wasn't the issue. I actually liked it better. Although I had to ask my group what he was actually talking about, what the whole point of the talk was about.
Yes, we had a bit of discussion about that. So let me just quickly run a brief intro. And hello, everybody, and this is Matthew and Darren back to have a quick, brief chat about session number 4 of the Genexis course
was a gentleman talking about DNA. Now, let me see if I can completely butcher his name. I do apologise to everybody who's got better enunciation than myself. That was Praveen Sethupathi, PhD, and he has a PhD from a Department of Medical Sciences. I haven't got it in front of me, but he's also connected to BioLogos, which is a name that will be familiar, I think, with most of our listeners. So Darren and I are just jumping on to have a quick chat about it. So, Darren, what did you like? What didn't you like?
Well, I really liked that my prediction from last week that it was going to be all about the DNA being a code was completely wrong. But I didn't really like that there wasn't any real substance to it. I mean, Praveen, he was obviously a competent person. He understood the biology. He explained why DNA doesn't really point to a god, which was nice when that question came up in the Q&A at the end. But yeah, it just, as far as I could tell, there was no real substance to it, and it just felt like I wasted this session.
Yeah, there is a little bit of a feeling of disappointment beyond that. I think what it was his talk, I think, was a cut down version of something much longer that he does. But I also got the feeling that there was a narrative element built into his talk. So to sketch out the narrative as I saw it, was he talked a bit about DNA and what DNA is and some of the great things about it, about if you unravel all the strands and stitch them all up together, you get a length that is ridiculously long, and how you can imagine something that long being wound up and tied into a ball and actually making a human that's got the small physical stature that we have, and things like that. And it was all a very natural explanation of DNA. And then he rolled it up a little bit and talked about humanity and what it is to be a human. How do we measure a human? And he talked about, is a human the sum of their cells? And said, but about 50% of the cells that make your body are not actually human cells. There's stacks of bacteria. And then he says, well, what if it's actually your DNA? What if we pull out the DNA, and is that what makes you human? And well, actually, not really, because about 10% of your DNA has a viral origin. So what makes you human isn't just human DNA. And then he rolled that on forwards, and his suggestion at the end was what makes us human is the fact that we have religion, we have theology, we have God. And it was that subtle appeal to mystery at the end. And my group time, they kind of got the story, but they didn't really find it so wonderful. I think he told it in such a cut down and I'm going to say wishy-washy way that it didn't really land. The firebrand atheist in my group just went off on one on that. He just wasn't impressed by it at all. I kept quiet for most of the discussion that the others talked because I didn't really have much to say other than I got the narrative, but I didn't get the conclusion.
Yeah, I didn't even get the narrative. As soon as we went into our talks, I said, okay, you guys talk Christianese. What the hell is he talking about? Because as soon as he stopped trying to define humans, because it was sort of like a real hard switch for him. He was trying to define humans, and then he started talking about the Bible and Genesis, and it completely lost me. And so what James said, he's my team leader, nice guy, by the way, I really like him, is that the whole point was of his talk was that the DNA shows that we're closely connected with the rest of the world, and Genesis tells the same story of us being closely connected to the rest of the world. And I completely missed that. I definitely did not get that from the talk, but that's apparently what the Christians got out of it. In my group, anyways.
Yeah, and do you remember him saying anything about the soul? Because I think I missed that, but several people mentioned in my group that he talked about the soul and they thought that was great.
I did not catch any soul talk there, unless that was what they were assuming his talk about beauty and wonder and that kind of thing is.
Yes, because I genuinely don't remember him even saying the word soul in his talk. So I'm pretty sure I'd have sat up and paid attention and typed that in, and I've got nothing in my notes about soul. So either I blurred because of when he started talking about God and missed it, or maybe it was really, really subtle and they just jumped on it.
Yeah, that's possible for me too. He talks so slowly that I was having a hard time focusing and not getting distracted.
Yeah, I did have much the same. I suddenly realised I hadn't typed any notes for a few bits and I'd missed what he was talking about. So, but I did try. I did enjoy the first half of what he was saying about the wonders of what it is to be human, and that to be human isn't actually to be 100% human. It is essential that you have all these other bits, the bacteria from our environment, the cells from our evolutionary history, the viruses rather, from our evolutionary history. And certainly without those two major components, humanity as we get it simply can't exist. And I thought that was good. And for me, that is a nail in the wall for materialism, personally, is the way I see it. There is a bit I would like to jump on. I know it wasn't really the subject of this talk, but he did say it during his presentation. And this was, he said that the idea of a conflict between science and faith is a fallacy. And he said that quite near the beginning. But then towards the end, and then he reiterated it in the questions, that this whole idea of God, because one of the questions, I think it was the first question, was, is the hand of God in our DNA? And which directly addresses this point. And he said, you need to be careful about making that assumption because it's not a solid conclusion. You know, people will look at the DNA and look at science and they don't necessarily see God. And so he asserted that we need to be careful about our scientific endeavors and then automatically concluding God from our scientific endeavors because it's not a hard and fast conclusion. He didn't say it, but the obvious lead on to the next bit is you can't do an experiment in the lab to show God, and therefore all of these other things just don't show God. But he said right at the very beginning, the idea there is no conflict between science and faith. It's a fallacy. But if you're going to use science to try to claim a God, if you're going to deny that science can be used to define a God, like he said, then you are essentially defining a conflict between science and faith because one cannot lead to the other. And so that was what I got from the talk, which was absolutely nothing to do with the subject.
Yeah, I've got fairly strong opinions about this whole science versus religion conflict thing that's going on. I agree with him that a person can be religious and still do science, but I disagree with him that science doesn't have anything to say about the claims that the religious are making. Because the reality is when a scientist goes into the lab, they don't bring their God with them. And they never find God in any of the experiments they do. If they did propose a God, even all the other religious scientists out there would still make fun of them for proposing a religious reason for something happening. For me, that's a pretty huge indicator that there is, in fact, a conflict between science and religion, and science is winning.
Yes, I will absolutely agree with that. I say that there is a conflict as well. And as soon as a Christian will say, you can't test God in the lab, you are defining that conflict into existence.
Yeah, because anything that's perceivable by people is measurable in the lab. So if it's not measurable in the lab, that means humans can't perceive it, which means you have no business making up stories about this thing that you can't perceive.
Yeah, the takeaway really was what we can understand naturally and scientifically about our DNA is all amazing stuff. We do discover utterly amazing stuff. Some of the people in my group, they didn't know the thing about 10% of our DNA probably varies exactly from part of the world to part of the world, but around about 10% is virus. Somebody in our group had never heard that stat before and was utterly blown away by it, thought it was quite a staggering percentage. And it is when you think about it. But then when you think about it in the context of the length of evolutionary history, it shouldn't really be too surprising. But what it does show is it shows we are the result of a very long, utterly naturalistic process, and we can understand parts of it in quite minute detail. And it's great. That's a big win for human ingenuity and a big win for science and a big win for things that we can learn wholly naturally. And then you get to the question section, and partway through the question section, somebody says, what do you think it means to be a human? And the best answer he could give was, to be a human is to be an image bearer of God. And suddenly we're out of the science lab again. We're out of things that we can detect. We're out of things that we can measure. And that's where religion lives.
Yeah, and I wonder if he even knows what he means when he says an image bearer of God. I mean, is that something that actually has a definition in Christianity, or is that just something that's a vague platitude?
It's very definitely Christianese. I think Christians probably understand that better than people who have never spent time inside a church listening to sermons. It's the language of that, the image bearer thing, is very much strikes some kind of mental image of a very real picture. But that's not really what Christians mean. When they say an image bearer, they don't mean the physical image of God. They mean the characteristics of God. So love probably goes to the fruits of the Holy Spirit conversation that we had when we on our Alpha course in an episode which is up in the history. By the time you're listening to this, it'll be several months in our back catalogue. So it's that kind of thing. It's what God has bestowed onto us. Which I think that came up in my group discussion, actually, this very specific subject. And my group leader, he talked about, our humanity is what is bestowed upon us by God. And that's a very similar kind of meaning to the image bearer of God thing. It's very much a Christian thing. It's not a scientific thing. And I guess I'm okay with humanity being described as something that is religious, because as soon as you take the religious element out of it and look at it just from a materialistic way, we are just one animal, one creature that has evolved amongst a sea of other animals and creatures that have evolved.
Yeah, according to Praveen, he has sort of the same view, because he said that the only reason we have value is because God chooses to give us value.
Yeah.
So I mean, the question I put out wasn't actually asked was, if it's God that gives us value, then if God didn't give us value, does that mean we would have no value? And I'm guessing that was probably too much of a divisive question.
Yeah, and I think there's conclusions that can come from that kind of questions. If you have no value, it's because God has not given you value. Well, then that immediately opens up the challenge of, well, is this God that you're talking about a truly loving God? And that's a whole other conversation.
Well, it does answer the question why a loving God would torture people for all eternity if he doesn't view them as having any value.
Then it's no longer a problem. It's not a moral issue then, is it? Because they've got no value. Who cares?
Well, I mean, it's still a moral issue. I would still say it makes them not loving, but it sort of puts a spotlight on that whole pretending to love thing.
Yeah. So is this going to be a really short digest then?
I think so. There was really nothing, like I said at the very beginning, there was just no real content to the thing. It was a little bit about information about DNA that was kind of cool, and then a little bit about the Bible that was kind of pointless, and then that was it.
Yeah. Interesting, because the very strong atheist in my group, he's much more outspoken than I am. He's opened up straight. It was much better than last week's one. We had somebody who knew about his subject, but it was all still rubbish. And then that was it. That was the sum total of what he said.
Well, yeah, it's because his expertise is in DNA, but he didn't actually apply that expertise into his talk at all. I mean, a couple of cool facts, and then it was all theology. And it's like, how does your expertise add to the conversation if all you're going to do is say theological stuff that your area of expertise has nothing to say about? I mean, it's... So anyways.
Yeah. It reminded me of Dennis Alexander. He did this talk at last year's Genexis. And I'm pretty sure I've read one of his books. I think it's called... I'm trying to do this out of memory. I think his book is called Creation or Evolution, Do We Have to Choose, or something like that. And somebody lent it to me, and I read it. So it was about 4, maybe even 5 years ago that I read it. But I came away, having read that book, with similar kind of feelings that we've come out from reading this. He's got loads and loads of chapters, really good chapters describing evolution in really good, accessible language. And then right at the end, he's got this chapter which reads like it's tacked on as an afterthought about humanity and God's place in humanity. And it
feels different reading through it in terms of the narrative that's throwing through the chapters and the technical language that he's using. It's very different to the other chapters. I remember thinking, okay, good, here we've got to the meat here. He's now going to tie all of that really good language that he's given about science and evolution and DNA and all that, and he's going to tie that to the concept of God and humanity, and he's going to tell me how I can link one to the other. And he didn't. That link, that really crucial bit, the bit that I was really waiting for, the bit that I read the whole book for, never appeared. And I feel the same with this talk. Yeah, he had this great bit about how awesome DNA is, about how much of a hodgepodge of mixed up stuff that it is that makes us human. And then there's this bit about God and how great God is and how wonderful he's just bestowed these things like beauty and joy and love on us. But the whole bit that ties the two ideas together simply doesn't exist.
Yeah, I would have been much more happy with it had he just done a Q&A for the entire time and just let people ask about, okay, well, I've heard this argument for DNA showing that God exists. What do you think of this? And just have him sort of go through, use his expertise to sort of comment on those questions. Even if I didn't agree with his conclusions, it would have still been a better use of time, in my opinion.
Yeah, because there was really nothing new, and he very definitely was flagging up a warning about looking at DNA and seeing God. Yeah, he said, be careful of proofs of God from the DNA or something along that. He didn't say exactly those words, but it was that kind of meaning. He made that, and I think he made that quite clear. So where do you go? Where do you get to God? And, if all you're going to do is see the natural in the natural, the step to God is still too big. And I think this is going to be a common thing. Thanks, Dan.
All right, have fun.
And Jim, cheers. Bye.
You have been listening to a podcast by Reason Press. To get in touch, email reasonpress@gmail.com or see our website, reasonpress.net, where you'll also find our book, Still Unbelievable. We welcome more feedback, and you might even end up on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. You can hear more of her music at soundcloud.com/hollybishop. You can support us by buying some of Holly's music and telling her we sent you.